The story of King Edward VIII is almost always told as the ultimate romance, a king who gave up his throne for the woman he loved. But what if that love story was also a very convenient cover for a political crisis the government desperately needed to solve? This is the story of how a royal scandal, a reluctant king, and a constitutional showdown didn't just remove one monarch, but unexpectedly created another, Queen Elizabeth II. For centuries, the British monarch ran one simple, unwavering rule: succession. It was a line of inheritance so rigid it seemed nothing could break it. And then, in 1936, the unthinkable happened. A king, popular and in his prime, voluntarily gave up the most famous throne on earth. The simple answer is that he did it for love. The more complicated truth involves a clash between tradition and modernity, a government push to its breaking point, and a family that was terrified of its own secrets. This wasn't just a king choosing a wife. It was a crisis that would redefine the crown and set a 10-year-old girl on an unforeseen path to becoming Britain's longest reigning monarch. When Edward, Prince of Wales, became king in January 1936, he was a global celebrity. He was handsome, charismatic, and a veteran of the First World War. To many, he felt like a breath of fresh air for an ancient institution. He toured the empire, captured the public's imagination, and was, by all accounts, immensely popular. His father, King George V, saw things very differently. He was deeply troubled by his son's fast lifestyle, his string of affairs with married women, and his casual attitude towards his royal duties. The old king was so worried, he famously predicted to one of his courtiers, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months. The source of this impending ruin, in the eyes of the establishment, was one woman, Wallis Simpson. She was an American, a socialite, and most damningly, on the way to being twice divorced. Their relationship began in the early 1930s, while Wallis was still married to her second husband. Edward was completely infatuated, showering her with jewels and bringing her into royal circles, where she was met with a wall of icy disapproval. For the British establishment in the 1930s, Wallis Simpson was unsuitable in every way imaginable. As king, Edward was also the supreme governor of the Church of England. At the time, the church flatly forbade remarrying if a former spouse was still alive. Wallis had 2 living ex-husbands. For the king to marry her would be a direct defiance of his own church's teachings, a moral and constitutional red line. Beyond religion, there were other problems. Those in power saw her as a manipulative social climber. Government and the royal family were completely united in their opposition. This wasn't a private romance, it was a constitutional crisis waiting to happen. As 1936 wore on, the crisis got deeper. The British press had a gentleman's agreement to stay silent, but American and European papers were having a field day with stories about the King and Mrs. Simpson. When she officially filed for her second divorce that October, the situation exploded. The key political player in this drama was Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. His government was already uneasy with Edward's unconventional style. The marriage was the final straw. On November 16th, Baldwin met the king and laid out the situation in stark terms. The people would not accept Wallis Simpson as queen. The government of the Dominions, like Canada and Australia, had also made it clear they were against the marriage. Baldwin gave the king 3 options: end the relationship, marry against the government's advice and trigger a massive political crisis, or abdicate. Edward tried to find a way out. He proposed a morganatic marriage where Wallis could be his wife but not his queen. Baldwin's cabinet rejected it immediately. There was no such thing in British law. Government's position was immovable. They saw Edward's obsession with Wallis as a total dereliction of his duty. There were even whispers in the halls of power about his political judgment, including apparent sympathies for Nazi Germany. But the constitutional crisis was the official reason. Some historians argue Baldwin successfully boxed the king, using his influence to make sure abdication became the only way out. The king was cornered. Faced with an impossible choice between his crown and the woman he loved, Edward's decision shook the world. On December 10, 1936, at his home, Fort Bellevarde, he signed the formal abdication papers with his 3 brothers, including the next king, as witnesses. He had been king for just 327 days. The following evening, he spoke to the nation and the world in an historic BBC radio broadcast, now styling himself as Prince Edward. He delivered one of the most famous speeches of the 20th century. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility," he explained, "and to my discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and the support of the woman I love." And with that, he was gone. The next day, he left Britain for Austria, waiting for Wallis Simpson's divorce to be finalised. They married in France the following year, became the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, but they would spend the rest of their lives in exile, largely shunned by the royal family. The public was shocked and felt betrayed. The man they thought they knew had, in their eyes, abandoned his sacred duty. The monarchy, an institution built on continuity, had been shaken to its core. The abdication didn't just remove a king, it created a new one. Edward's younger brother, Prince Albert Bertie, to his family, never wanted to be king. He was a shy, private man who struggled with a severe stammer and had always lived in the shadow of his dazzling older brother. The news was devastating. He reportedly broke down and wept, terrified of the responsibility being forced upon him. Still, he accepted his duty to signal a return to stability and the traditional values of his father. He took the name George VI. He wrote to his brother Edward, and he was inheriting a rocking throne. Do his best to make it steady again. King George VI, with his wife Queen Elizabeth by his side, worked tirelessly to restore public faith in the monarchy. His quiet courage, especially during World War II, when they stayed in bombed-out London, would ultimately save the institution. But the abdication had another, equally huge consequence. When Bertie became King George II, his 10-year-old daughter, Princess Elizabeth, was suddenly the heir to the throne. Her life changed forever in a single moment. Her grandfather, King George V, had always been fond of Lilibet, and once said, "I pray to God my eldest son will never marry and have children, and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne." In a strange twist of fate, he got his wish. From that moment on, Elizabeth's entire life was refocused on her destiny. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She was the future queen. Her education shifted to constitutional history and law. She was slowly guided into the duties of the state, a role she was never supposed to have, all because her uncle chose a woman over a crown. The scandal that nearly broke the House of Windsor had, in fact, placed it in the hands of the person who would come to define it for over 70 years. The abdication of Edward VIII was so much more than a love story. It was a constitutional crisis that forced a showdown between personal desire and public duty. It revealed the real power the government held over the monarch and the lengths it would go to protect the crown's stability. Stanley Baldwin and the establishment may have pushed one king out, but in doing so, they cleared the way for another. The crisis created King George VI, a reluctant but dedicated king who guided his country through war. And most importantly, it took his young daughter, Princess Elizabeth, from a life of relative royal quiet and set her on a direct path to the throne. Her entire reign, defined by an unbreakable sense of duty, can be seen as a direct response to her uncle's choice. He was the king who walked away. She became the queen who would always stay. The scandal of 1936 didn't destroy the monarchy, it remade it, and in the process created the queen who would define the modern age. So what do you think? Was Edward VIII a romantic hero who sacrificed everything for love? Or a king who abandoned his post? Let us know in the comments. And for deep dives into royal history, make sure you subscribe. Thanks for watching.